Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the second half of the second session of the Africana Muslim and Genealogies of White Supremacy Sawyer seminar for the interdisciplinary study of Blackness and Muslimness. The seminar is led by Professors Suad Abdel Khabir, Samir Ali, and myself, Murad Idris, and it aims to address the ways that the racialized figure of the Africana Muslim, or Muslims from Africa and its diasporas, has been hyper-visible in the theory and practice of racism since the days of Columbus, yet has been largely invisible in scholarship on critical race studies, white supremacy, and Middle East studies. Over the course of the year, the seminar brings together leading scholars, thinkers, and activists to reconceptualize the study of the African and the Muslim and recenter the Africana Muslim beyond the cracks of traditional disciplines and narratives. Our goal is to trace the intersection of race and religion in the production and reproduction of white supremacy in both theory and praxis. The seminar is supported by the Mellon Foundation and housed at our home institution, the University of Michigan, the origins of which are a land grant from the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Adawa, and Potawatomi, and the Wyandot. Our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained in unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. Knowing where we are changes neither the past nor the present, but it is through scholarship and pedagogy that we work to create a future in which the past is thoroughly understood and the present supports human flourishing and justice, while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. Today, Session 2, Plantations, aims to generate a wide-ranging reflections on questions and themes raised by plantations by way of the theory and lived experience of the Africana Muslim. The session explores plantations as a site for the economic, political, social, and affective orders that emerge from constructions and reproductions of plantations from the Americas to the Indian Ocean region. Examining the plantation as a site, as opposed to slavery as a phenomenon, enables scholars to see and analyze the convergence of slavery with capitalist exploitation of land and labor, and the expropriation of land by colonial conquest. Our session aims to address the contexts, structures, and afterlives of capitalist exploitation and land appropriation that were central, and the relationships of power, slave owner and enslaved, settlers and native, that were raced, classed, gendered, and religious and formal and intimate. If the plantation is one of the key sites of modernity, what happens to the site and the modernity it represents when we examine it as a space in which the Muslim, the African, and the Africana Muslim were racialized and resisted that racialization by imagining worlds otherwise? Earlier today, Dr. Michael Gomez delivered the keynote address for this session, and now we are honored to have Doctors Margarita Rosa, Jason R. Young, and Nathaniel Mathews presenting on the topic, with Doctors Aliyah Khan and Michael Gomez offering some comments. Dr. Margarita Rosa is a Harlem-based public scholar specializing in Afro-Latin American and Black Atlantic history and modern and contemporary art. She received her PhD from Princeton University and did her postdoctorate at Stanford University. Dr. Rosa's historical academic scholarship has been published in the Journal of African American History, Slavery and Abolition, and The Black Scholar, among other venues. She was the winner of the 2024 Letitia Woods Article of the Year Award by the Association of Black Women Historians. She is currently a lecturer in the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College at the City University of New York. Jason Young is an associate professor of history at the University of Michigan. He's the author of Rituals of Resistance, African Atlantic Religion in Congo and the Low Country region of Georgia and South Carolina in the era of slavery, and co-editor of The Souls of W.E.B. Du Bois, New Essays and Reflections with Edward J. Blum. He is a co-curator of a traveling exhibition, Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina, that opened at the Met in September 2022. Young has published articles in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Africana Religions, and the Journal of Southern Religion, among others. Nathaniel Mathews is Associate Professor of Africana Studies at SUNY Binghamton. He is the author of Zanzibar Was a Country, Exile and Citizenship Between East Africa and the Gulf, which won the 2024 Monsoon Book Prize in History and was named one of 2024's Books of the Year by History Today. His broader research interests are in decolonization and modern citizenship, comparative African diasporas, slavery and race in Muslim societies, Islamic intellectual history, and Swahili-phone worlds. He's currently working on a second book project examining immigration and naturalization in colonial Zanzibar. Dr. Aliyah Khan is an associate professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan. She is also the director of the Global Islamic Studies Center, or GISC, at the International Institute at U of M. She specializes in post-colonial Caribbean literature and the contemporary literature of the Muslim and Islamic worlds, with an intersectional focus on race, gender, and Islam in the hemispheric Americas. Her book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, on the literature and music of enslaved Afro-Caribbean and indentured Indo-Caribbean Muslims and their descendants in Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, earned honorable mention in the 2020-2021 Modern Language Association Prize for a first book. And finally, Dr. Michael Gomez, a Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University and the Director of NYU Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. He has taken on numerous leadership and foundational roles in scholarship, projects, international committees, education, university departments, and publication and research initiatives, which you heard an overview of during the introduction to his keynote earlier today. He is also the author of numerous books. The most recent is the multi-award-winning African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, which was published in 2018. And his Cambridge History of the African Diaspora is a 3-volume series scheduled for 2025. Dr. Gomez is a recipient of the American Historical Association's 2023 Award for Scholarly Distinction. And so, without further ado, I'll now turn it over to our first presenter, who is Dr. Margarita Rosa.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from wherever you are. I am Dr. Margarita Rosa, and I want to thank everyone at U Michigan for making this event possible. And finally, I want to thank Doctors Aliyah Khan and Michael Gomez for offering the commentary today. So as we go about these conversations, something that I really want to do is center us deeply on an examination of what the plantation is and how we can think beyond the actual space of the quote-unquote plantation as site specific to think of the Americas as sites of plantation geographies. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to share this right here. And let's go ahead and share it this way. I'm not sure how to make it full screen. I feel like maybe view, I'm not really sure. But let's go ahead and share it this way. And the first map I want to show you is this 1570 map that is one of the first maps that shows the Americas as a whole in what they were perceiving as their fullness. So I want to think about what it means for this new colonized space to be considered the property of Spanish and Portuguese kingdoms. In one of the earliest maps of the whole Americas, the Planosphere of 1507, we see that in those descriptions, it literally says all of this land belongs to the Spaniards and to the Kingdom of Castile. So we ought to recognize that when we're talking about plantations, we're talking about a term that also applies to all of the Americas. So let's start from that assumption. Now, I really want to show y'all direct archival documents because that's really what's going to help us understand the present moment. So one of the ways that I want to think about plantation models is the way that they are inescapable, the way that maroonage away from plantation is already an act of rebellion, even a small escape. So most of us have learned that the first African descendant person to reach the Americas, as far as European historiography goes, is Juan Moreno, that he was on the first voyage of Christopher Columbus, that perhaps he was the person who even yelled land. Well, in 1502, we actually got this marginal note, which, as far as I can tell, hasn't been studied by anyone yet. But the marginal note on this left corner says, Juan Moreno fue, he was hit, he was slashed por cazar y por bellaco. So he was, it says here, Juan Moreno was whipped for going out hunting and for being bellaco, for being bellicose, for being rebellious. Now we have learned that Juan Moreno was a free person, and yet within this context of a plantation model, whether you're free or not, if you are Black and indigenous, you're existing within the plantation model. If you are bellaco, if you are bellicose, you are marooning, you are rebelling. I mean, bellaco as a word comes from the same root as rebellion. But as we know, the early Africans in the Americas were defying this time and time again. Maps of the 1500s, the 16th century on the island of Haiti show that there was more land that was populated and sometimes even controlled by Black Maroon communities than there were actual Spanish towns. If we look at these maps based on the historiography on the island, we see these black tiny dots, and those are the areas of Spanish settlements. But look at these broad strokes of gray. Those are actually areas of maroon activity, and it does not go down. The number only amplifies as the century goes on, right? And then, of course, the Spaniards start taking more land. So the idea or the myth that plantations ruled the early Caribbean is exactly that, a myth. Let's see more evidence. We see this incredible letter that is sent to the crown that essentially says that the Spaniards have to go out of their houses in squads, that the miners get together to sleep in shifts of 8 with their spears in their hands for fear of the said blacks. Right? That's interesting. So they're saying that the impact of the Black Maroon communities was so strong that the white settlers, the Spanish settlers, were scared to go out on their own, right? And another note is that the word maroon, of course, we know comes from cimarrón, the Spanish. And where does the word cimarrón come from? It actually comes from the Taíno word or the Arawak word cimara, which means a flecha, an arrow. And so similarly to how a maroon comes out of the mountain and attacks, so does an arrow. So this early version of the word maroon related to camouflage, related to all of a sudden attacking. Let's see another part of the same letter. In that same letter, they say that there are so many of these uprisen Blacks that in certain lagoons that are on the northern coast of Samaná, it is said that they have bohíos and houses very well made. So you mean to tell me that the communities themselves were building villages because they had managed to maroon and they had managed to start forming their own society out of this tragedy of being found on this island, of being captured and placed on this island. Some of you may be familiar with the work that I've done around the 1835 Malay revolt in in Brazil, in Salvador de Bahia, Brazil. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, essentially in 1835, a group of almost 600 African Muslims, both slaves and both enslaved people and free people, managed to plan the most exhaustive plan for a rebellion in Brazil at this time. And although the rebellion was quelled within a couple of hours and several of the leaders were killed, what's important about this rebellion is the documents that were left behind because of it that were kept as police records. So essentially, these documents that you see in front of you were actually worn as amulets, as items that the enslaved Africans and the free Africans would wear on their necks in preparation for the revolt. And they were taken from their bodies and now held as police records. These are two of the images. I have some more that are not digitalized. This one that you see right here in this book that I have is actually the Fatiha. And so you can see that the Muslims were actually retaining their religion and were actually using madrasas and schools in order to run their Bahian education. In fact, we learned that most of the ulama in Bahia were enslaved, as were their students, and they would escape in order to hold these courses, in order to host these moments of refuge with their teachers. Now, we can see from the spelling and even from the correct Fatiha that we see here that by this time there was a lot of connection to Arabic and to African society. But after the 1835 Malay Revolt, a couple of things happened. First of all, four of the leaders were killed. Around 400 to 500 estimated Africans, both free and enslaved, were deported back to West Africa, where they landed in Dahomey. And the saying goes that that's what happened. And there they set up a madrasa as well. So interestingly enough, we might ask ourselves, well, what happened to the Muslim society there? Interestingly enough, no one has done research on this yet, as far as I can tell, in the American Academy. When I was in Brazil, I ran into a sheikh in Bahia, and he gave me this book that I haven't worked on yet, and I don't think anyone has. And it's about Turkish a Turkish wealthy man whose shipwrecked in Bahia, Brazil, in the 1860s. And when he saw that there was a Muslim population there, he actually decided to stay. Now, Islam at this time was banned. So was the reading of Arabic. So how did he know that they were actually Muslim? Well, because he was wearing Turkish clothing, one of the brothers came up to him and said, Salam alaikum. He at first thought that he was being mocked, but then he realized, oh no, these are actual Muslims. And what he writes in this testimony that he wrote in Arabic, is that they were Muslim, but they no longer knew how to do the Fatiha. You have to remember, these are the children who are being born after the Malay Revolt, the children who were left behind in Brazil or who had to stay behind in Brazil. And so these kids, for example, one of the things that they did was that when they did sujud, they kissed the floor, right? They hardly knew the Fatiha. And so this scholar, he proclaims that he actually stayed there for a couple of years and that he had over 600 students. And of course, this is his own testimony, so we have to take it with a grain of salt, but his testimony is very accurate to what would have been the case. His name was Abdul Rahman al-Baghdadi, for anyone who wants to look this up. I don't know if this book exists anywhere else. I was given it as a gift. Now, I want to talk about something else because we hardly ever talk about female-led maroonage, female-led rebellion, and I want to talk about two instances before we switch it up. So the first person I want to talk about is Maria de Cota, who in 1575, once she was liberated in the city of Seville, Spain, having been born in Santo Domingo, She said she made a testimony in her travel petition in first person, and we see that first person here. We see this that looks like a J or a Y rather that says yo soy, right? So she's saying it in first person, and the scribe is writing it. She says, I, Maria de Cota, a Black woman, say that I am a natural of the city of Santo Domingo, and around 18 years ago, I have come to these parts of Seville, and now I want to go back. Agora me quiero volver. What? She is saying that she's already in 1575 identifying with the Americas and even seeing Santo Domingo as her place of refuge where she wants to go. So I think we have to broaden our idea of what it means to maroon and to be a refuge. And she says that part of the reason why she wants to go back is because she is single and free from captivity. The last archive that I want to show y'all, and I want y'all to look at the bottom of your screen, look at the chat button, or rather it's going to be a Q&A button, and I want you to put any question there that results out of this presentation so that we can address it in the question and answer period. So this last document that I want to show you is from 1835. It's from 1842. And it's the Escalera Revolt in Matanzas, Cuba. And in this revolt, which was led by two women of the Lucumí tradition, the West African Lucumí tradition, Fermina and Carlota led the rebellion. Fermina was 24 years old when she led this rebellion. And the archives say, these police records that were kept say that she went up to the plantation and went up to the Black rebels, telling them that the whites were escaping over there. But she saw too many of them running after the whites or the plantation owners. And then she actually pointed at the overseer and she yelled out to them, take that fat white man and chop him up with a machete. Dale de machetazos, because he's the one who put you in chains. And let's look at the document a little closer because this is such a radical thing to see in the 1800s in an actual archive. It says dale de machetazos. I mean, what a Caribbean word, what Caribbean verbiage for saying such a thing, and also Black Caribbean verbiage. So we see that with both Maria and with Fermina, we have a Black femme identification with Caribbean and Brazilian, with Caribbean rather identity. The last thing I want to show y'all, let's see if it'll play, is an actual clip from the film Audi in 1989 by or with Beatriz Nascimento, who is a scholar that we should all know about more. She's a Black feminist scholar, and this is what she said about Quilombo. I'm going to play it, then I'm going to translate it.
Centro dos guerreiros. Cabia às mães preparar o alimento e colocar nas florestas, não só para oferendar aos seus mitos arcaicos, mas para também alimentar o fugitivo. Cabia à mulher sustentar o fogo.
Cabía a mulher sustentar a fuga. It was within the woman's realm to sustain fugitivity. And she's saying it's not because of some primitive idea of what women should do, is because sustaining the actual Maroon community was fundamental to its survival. So similar to the Dominican scholar Celsa Albert Batista, again, these are people who we don't study in the American Academy. They argue that there is no maroonage without woman maroons, that anytime you see the gender neutral plural, esclavos, cimarrones, you're actually also having to include women in those statements. And so with this presentation, I really want us to think about amplifying and broadening both our vision of plantation, what it means to maroon from the plantation, and let's take this last concept into consideration. There's a Black Brazilian concept of quilombo. Of course, we know that quilombo is the equivalent of maroon community in English and the equivalent of palenque in Spanish. But we know that Quilombo in the 70s and 80s by Abdias Nascimento and Beatriz Nascimento was transformed into a central concept of Black political thought. So I want us to think of the plantation and the Quilombo as two separate spaces. The plantation as a space of oppression and the Quilombo as a space of refuge. And sometimes that happened on the same island. Sometimes that happened in the same space. And so we ought to think as marooning as something that can also be spiritual, as something that can also be within a community that might actually exist within a plantation geography. Thank you all so much for listening to this presentation, and I look forward to hearing everyone else. And again, remember that the chat box is at the bottom, so I look forward to continuing this. Thank you all so much.
Hello all, my name is Jason Young, and just like Professor Rosa, I just want to start by saying thank you to the organizers of this panel. They've done such a really good job, and I really do appreciate you all for thinking about me and for all of the care that you've shown in putting this panel together. I'll say that I'm working at the intersection of slavery and memory. I'm particularly interested in 20th and 21st century re-performances or recreations of the slave past, and trying to think about what those more contemporary incidents of memory can tell us about meaning and meaning making for a more distant past. What this also means, as it relates to me, is that my own thinking about the intersections of plantations and slavery and enslaved African Muslims begins in what might be a counterintuitive place. This question took shape for me in May 2022 as I sat in a Charleston, South Carolina opera hall surrounded by the city's economic and cultural elite. I'll just say that one more time. I was in the middle of an opera hall in Charleston surrounded by that city's economic and cultural elite. There was them and there was me. The audience had gathered that evening for the premiere of Omar, an opera in 2 acts, written and composed by the Grammy Award-winning musician Rhianna Giddens, who had previously come to fame. Some of you may know her as the lead singer of the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Giddens composed the opera with Michael Abels, who is well known for his scores for films like Get Out and Us. Now, just by way of context, but also in this dizzying moment of time passing, I would like to just return us for just a moment to May 2022 and the world outside the Opera Hall, which was at that moment abuzz with a series of highly significant moments. So for example, 1 month earlier, on April 7th, Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed as Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Just a few days earlier, on May 24th, a gunman in Uvalde, Texas, killed 19 students and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School. And just 1 month after Omar opened in Charleston, South Carolina, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, effectively criminalizing abortion in much of the nation. So it was in that context that Omar opened, and it did so, as one might imagine, with a resounding recitation of Al-Fatiha, the opening surah or chapter of the Quran. Over the course of an expansive stretch of time and measure and music, James McCorkle, who played the titular role in the opera, assumed his role as muezzin, calling this unconventional ummah or audience to order. I can't overstate just how disorienting that call to prayer was for me, sitting in the middle of that opera hall in Charleston, South Carolina at that particular political moment. Now, I wasn't disoriented because I'm not used to hearing it. I wasn't disoriented because I'm not used to responding to it. But rather, Charleston's own history of racism and Islamophobia struck a discordant tone for me in that particular moment. This could be a long list, but I'm just going to give you a short one to give you a sense of how some of these issues had been working out in Charleston prior to the opening of Umar. So in August 2022, a local councilman, Tommy Newell, achieved some notoriety in Charleston when he posted a photo of himself with a caption that read, and I'm reading from his post here, "I had the ultimate and absolute honor of playing a terrorist, the Sheikh of Berkeley County, in a training exercise for our American badasses," end quote. That photo included other men and women who were variously dressed in keffiyeh and kufis and full niqab. The photo had been taken during an anti-terrorist training session in which law enforcement had dressed up presumptive terrorists in what they called Muslim or Arabic garb. A little bit before that, in 2019, South Carolina Republican State Senator Larry Grooms introduced Senate Bill 29 that would ban the application of foreign law in South Carolina. That bill was one of many thinly veiled so-called anti-Sharia law bills that were proposed throughout the country at that time. Earlier in the year, in 2019 as well, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham posted and then quickly deleted a selfie that he had taken with the far-right Dutch politician Geert Wilders, who advocated a ban on Muslim immigration to the Netherlands and who had once compared the Quran to Hitler's Mein Kampf. In addition to that, the Sotilli Theater, where Omar debuted, is located just a few blocks away from Emmanuel AME Church, the site of the 2015 terrorist attack on Black parishioners during a weekly Bible study session. And then scarcely more than a stone's throw further on from that church is Gadsden's Wharf, the place that Omar most likely landed in this country, bound in the hold of a slave ship when he first arrived in the country in 1807. I'll say also that Gadsden's Wharf is an incredibly important site in the history of African Americans. It's the site, the port of first arrival for approximately 50% of all African Americans who live in the country now and who are descended of that slave period. So that's the external world into which all of this opera was happening. Now, beyond this, and I feel I'm going to say this, just let me say it, and then I've got to move on to other stuff. So beyond everything that I just mentioned, and for fear of falling into understatement, Charleston has long been a tinderbox for questions of race, slavery, and religion. Let's just leave that an open box. I'll just leave it there and continue. I don't want to talk too much about Charleston, but you can imagine now the feeling that I felt of being disconcerted and somewhat uncomfortable at this moment of being in this large opera hall and hearing this really quite remarkable recitation of Al-Fatiha ringing out in the crowd. Let me show you something while we talk about it. I'm showing you here an image of what was the curtain of that opera. So when you came in, you saw this, you saw Umar ibn Said on this, on the curtain, kind of drawn in these, I'll say more about the Arabic that you see in a moment. One of the things that was really remarkable about the curtain is that the image was projected onto that curtain in such a way that Omar was blinking and making facial expressions. He was slightly moving his head from the right to the left. And so it was a kind of living embodiment on the curtain itself. That image is in some ways a kind of an abstraction of some of the portraiture that we have of Umar ibn Said. I mentioned Rhianna Giddens, who here is on the left. This is her in her role as a member of the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Those of you who are familiar or closer to the University of Michigan may know that Rhianna Giddens is spending this year, 2025, as an artist in residence here on campus. And so she's been traveling back and forth to campus. I think she was just here last year, in fact, and she's been doing performances and working through the archives for some of the more recent work that she's been doing. And here is an image of the full score, which I'll be quoting from a little bit as we go along. I'll show you some more images, but I'll leave you with my face again for a moment. We'll go back and forth. I'm going to offer, for those of you who are not familiar with the opera, just the briefest synopsis of the opera itself and of the biography of Omar ibn Said, this African Muslim who arrived in Charleston, South Carolina in 1807, who escaped to North Carolina, and who subsequently wrote an autobiography of his life. There's the biography, but then there's the opera. And so what I'm going to be talking about now is really the opera itself and not the biography. I think it's really important to make that distinction, that I'm talking now about the opera. So the opera opens and proceeds as a kind of expansive history of slavery and the slave trade, much on the order of the slave narrative genre. It begins in Futatoro, Senegal, and the opera opens with Umar ibn Said, who is depicted as an unsuspecting victim of the transatlantic slave trade. He's captured, shackled, thrown into the cargo hold of a ship. A slave auction scene quickly follows, where Omar witnesses the separation of an enslaved family. Before being sold himself to the villainous slave owner Johnson, Omar creates a distraction that makes possible the escape of Julie, an enslaved woman who had shown him a kindness on the auction block in the previous scene. On Johnson's plantation, Omar experiences the evils of the plantation system with its varied privations and violences, and he resolves to escape. When the second act of the play opens, Omar has successfully escaped from Johnson's plantation and has made his way to Fayetteville, North Carolina, before he's captured and jailed. While imprisoned, Omar prays and writes Quranic verses on the walls of his cell. Impressed by his literacy, Omar is, in the logic of the opera, Omar is rescued through sale to another plantation owner by the name of Owen, who's depicted as a kindly and Christian slave owner. Noting, and I'm just going to read from the libretto here, I'm not going to sing, but the kindly Christian master Owen says, well, there's always room on my plantation for a man who knows God, even if it's the wrong one. Now, importantly, both the villainous slave owner Johnson and the kindly Christian slave owner Owen are played by the same actor. They're meant to be played by the same actor. So you see the actor in one version as villainous, and then he comes back as the kindly Omar. As the kindly Owen. In what is my favorite part of this opera, Omar and Owen enter into what is, I'm going to say this, but I'm going to correct myself, enter into what is, in effect, a kind of rap battle around scriptures. And so they're throwing scriptures back at each other. But I don't want you to think that it's like in the form of a Hamilton rap battle. It's not that. It's still opera. And it operates as opera. But Omar, in reciting from Surah Al-Mulk, says, if all the water that you have were to sink down into the earth, who would give you running water in its place? The slave owner Owen responds with lines from 1 Timothy. Those who have believing masters should not be disrespectful because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better. Omar then follows by citing some lines from Psalms 123. And this exchange goes on for so long that eventually, and I'll show you a screen cap from the image, eventually the slave owner Owen is forced to acknowledge, well, I can see you know some things, right? There's this really interesting sense that Owen and Omar are kind of in this scriptural religious battle. While on the Owen plantation, Omar is reunited with the enslaved woman Julie, who reveals that her own father had been a practicing Muslim before he was sold away from her. Meanwhile, Owen has taken Omar under his wing, making a special project of him, intending to convert Omar to Christianity. Omar subsequently wrestles to resolve his own faith with the mandate of Christian conversion. Julie urges Omar to write of his experiences, and Omar obliges reluctantly, encouraging the people of the Americas to honor the tenets of their faith. Notably, while the opera opens with Al-Fatiha in Arabic, it ends with Omar reciting the verses again, though this time in an English translation. In this way, the opera ends not with freedom, the typical resolution in the slave narrative genre, but rather with a strained assimilation. This was a topic that came up during the keynote, And it's something that we may want to return to here. Okay. And it looks like I have 3 minutes. I'll take 3 of them. In all of this, the plantation looms really large in the show. The autobiography that Omar had written in Arab becomes stage set and stage design. Those lines are projected onto fabric that becomes the plantation site itself, and many of the players are wearing clothes that also include Omar ibn Said's lines from his autobiography. And so in that sense, his lines and his words are kind of walking all around the plantation. I'll end by saying a few things. I don't, at some points in like offering a synopsis of this opera, it may seem that I'm being, I don't know, snarky or critical or like petty or whatever. I don't know. I don't mean to criticize the opera for any of its historical inaccuracies or its understatements or overstatements or whatever. I experienced the opera both in my role as an audience member, but also subsequently in my role as a teacher and researcher as a powerful piece of meaning making. The power of the opera to make meaning is perhaps best reflected in the subsequent honor of being awarded a Pulitzer Prize in the following year, in 2023. Now, in all of this world making and plantation making, I think it's too facile to say that the plantation, as depicted in the opera, is highly stylized and sanitized. The plantation, as depicted in the opera, is highly stylized and highly sanitized. That's true. But that is in part a function of dramaturgy, where murder and violence and sex and politics and sexuality are all communicated through abbreviation and metaphor and nuance. As it relates to slavery, staged representations can only ever imply or gesture toward the violence inherent in the system. But one of the things that I do find really interesting is the way in which the opera was immediately taken up as a kind of healing ointment for American racial conflict. And so, for example, the main newspaper in Charleston, the Post and Courier, noted that the clear and present power of Omar to heal a country whose stories are not fully told should make this a prominent part of the operatic canon. The New York Times called the opera a melting pot inspired by bluegrass, hymns, spirituals, and more, with nods to traditions from Africa and Islam. And there is this sense in the reception of the opera that it has some sort of way of healing the nation's ailments. That sense of the opera as a potential healer of the country's ailments is indicated in the very last scene of the opera, which I'll close with. So as the opera draws to a conclusion, Omar announces, and again, I'm going to recite the libretto but not sing it. "I have a great and holy master. He allowed me to write to you." Now, ostensibly, Omar is referring to his earthly master, Owen, in these lines, that Owen has allowed him to write his autobiography. Of course, scholars have long debated this matter and have arrived at a fairly firm consensus that the system of slavery constituted a form of structural inherent violence that exceeded any interpersonal plantation niceties. And to return just for a moment to the slave narrative tradition, Frederick Douglass is clear that Christian slaveholders were indeed worse than their non-Christian counterparts, precisely because they used Christianity as a vehicle to express and justify their violences. And so in the end of the moment, at the end of the opera, there is this sense in which Owen, the kindly Christian master, provides a way for the audience, that economic and cultural elite of Charleston and other audiences who enjoyed the play, to find a kind of retreat from the evils of the system and to seek, in a way, refuge under the protective wing of this kindly master in a way that Omar, in the logic of the opera, had done as well. So I'll stop there, but I'm really interested in continuing these questions about meaning and meaning making, especially as it relates to not only slavery and the slave system historically, but also to contemporary reimaginations of that slave past. Thanks so much.
Okay, greetings everyone. It's a privilege and an honor to be with all of you, and thank you to the attendees for listening to us. This is a topic of interest to me, although I come at it maybe from a slightly different perspective as a historian, studying the east coast of Africa and another plantation system on the east coast of Africa and in Zanzibar. And as someone who has visited plantations in both Zanzibar and Mississippi, and actually in Mississippi lived adjacent to a plantation, I do think it's important to kind of unpack the material differences between plantation sites. And I'm particularly struck by the material differences in political economy, demography, and cultural exchange between those in Zanzibar and those in Mississippi. In particular, although both are part of this expansion of slavery in the global 19th century, in which the importance of the enslaved to productive labor really reaches its peak. And there are major differences that I think make a key difference, and they've been alluded to by some of our other speakers. One is that the long history of cultural exchange between the East African coast and East Africa and the Indian Ocean world more generally meant that even if there were a general attitude of superiority among the largely Arab slave masters in Zanzibar to their largely African slaves, there was also a great degree of cultural interest and cultural interchange, not only through marriage, but in practices of healing. And one can kind of contrast that with the colonial society of the Mississippi Delta and the plantations that emerged there in the 19th century. And really, the Delta actually really starts to pick up after the abolition of slavery as a site of the new arrangements of sharecropping. But what's striking about these plantations that emerge on the western frontiers of slavery in the antebellum period is the kind of aspiration to total control over labor, at the same time as there is extreme cultural distancing and assertion of a distance based on white supremacy. So that's something that strikes me immediately about this as somebody who's interested in comparative historical studies. But what I want to also remark on and bring in to this conversation is the way in which African Muslims in the Americas and on the plantations of the Americas tend to get caught by scholarship between two discourses. On the one hand, the discourse of Orientalism, that is the construction of the Muslim and the Easterner as other, and on the other hand, Africanism, the construction of Africans as different. And Toni Morrison has talked a lot about this, but it's also been elaborated for Arab-African relations more generally. And a lot of the scholars that I'm in conversation with today are well aware of these dynamics. But I want to talk about today engaging a theme that was sort of introduced to me by my grad school advisor, Dr. David Schoenbrunn, who's a historian of East Africa, who works with this concept of public healing. And in the time I have, I want to engage in a little bit of a reflection of what did an Islamically oriented, or what might an Islamically oriented public healing look like on the plantation. And scholar Theophilus Smith has coined this term pharmacosm to talk about some of these dynamics. But in large parts of West and East Africa, public healers were those individuals who helped ensure social prosperity. They brought rain, they ensured fertility, they helped to divine the future, they dealt with moral conundrums, they healed illnesses, they protected the community from malevolent manipulators of the unseen for selfish gain, which we would otherwise call witchcraft. And as I listen to these presentations, I'm struck by the public healing as having parallels to these roles and functions within African Muslim societies on both sides of the Atlantic that go beyond just the use of amulets, but also include the power of recitation, the power of divine speech, and the role of saintly intercessors to the divine. And the scholarship on Atlantic slavery has increasingly turned towards African history, in large part pioneered by one of our commenters and the keynote for today. And it strikes me that this tradition of Islamically oriented public healing, that we can find it being practiced ecumenically on both sides of the Atlantic. That is, large numbers of non-Muslims in both Africa and the Americas may have sought out services of skilled Muslim healers for various ends. The plantation in the Americas was a site of production of cash crops, of commodities, but it was also a site of carcerality and terror that broke people, that was designed to extract and break people, not only physically, but spiritually. One's labor and person was often surveilled, and despite public protestations that their slaves were, quote, happy, many Southern planters knew otherwise and were constantly, on edge and alert to the possibility of rebellion. In contradistinction to the forms of active resistance against the plantation economy, more well known to us as scholars, I think we can also bring our attention to the forms of what Sheikh Anta Babu calls greater jihad, that were part of the quotidian existence of Muslims on American plantations. And by greater jihad, I mean the ethical resources necessary for bearing up under oppression. That could be things like sabr or patience, refusing inner submission, which was a big part of the message of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, the Senegalese Sufi who founded the Mouridiya order. Okay. And then also community, stealing away communally to pray. And Gomez, in Exchanging Our Country Marks, has a whole section, a very interesting section on Muslims, Muslim prayer in the context of the plantation. And then I also want to urge us to read this incredible text, since Dr. Young brought up the life of Omar ibn Said. I Cannot Write My Life by Mbaye Lo and Carl Ernst. And it's one of the texts that, as I prepared the remarks for today, I read and meditated on. And one of the things that they really bring out is that Omar ibn Said's life and his writings were obscured by not only the white supremacy and racism of the society, but also by the condescending and ignorant attitudes of those who deemed themselves translators of his work. So they document, for instance, that most of the people that were translating his Arabic autobiography actually themselves did not know Arabic as well as Omar ibn Said, but they covered that ignorance with a racist condescension calling the Arabic that he wrote inferior or unreadable when they themselves did not have the knowledge necessary to translate it. The other thing I want to bring out in terms of this question of public healing is that a focus on external forms of power and counter resistance to power may at times, I don't want to deny their necessary importance. Individuals like John Brown and Harriet Tubman putting their lives on the line and willing to sacrifice for liberation. But there may be ways in which a focus on external forms of power may have us miss that there are ways in which African Muslims or Africana Muslims' relationship to the unseen is a source of power that exceeds or is not contained by a sort of materialist metaphysics that focuses on indices like state building, literacy, property, wealth, etc. There are ways in which Africana Muslims' relationship to the unseen on the plantation and the plantation's apparatus of control could only partially contain, or rather, I should say, the plantation and its apparatus of control could only partially contain this relationship to the unseen. And that it's worth also remembering here that when I say the word public healing, as it's been expounded on by scholars like Stephen Fireman and David Schoenbrun, that we should understand public healing as also something that harms oppressors, okay, that harms enemies, okay? It is not just a tool for healing those who are broken by structures of oppression, but it's also a tool by which to work against the iniquitous power of the oppressor, okay? And so just as healers in Africa had an ambiguous relationship to traditional forms of political power like kingship, I wonder if we can see Africana Muslims working on plantations as engaged in similar kinds of ambiguous relationships to power that don't fit neatly into boxes of resistance or accommodation. For instance, Africana Muslims acting as healers for slave owners, or even the ambiguous role of healers nursing people back to health in the on a plantation, in a context in which their health is going to be used to continue the exploitation of producing these commodities, okay? And then finally, I want to talk about or just maybe get us to think about and discuss the role of Muslim healers on the plantation in resolving intra-communal conflicts. So I think I am near the end of my time or at the end of my time, but these are some of the things that occur to me and as we discuss this very important topic. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Margarita, Jason, and Nathaniel for those really exciting presentations. Actually, I was like, I'm so excited to for us to have a conversation. And I'm gonna turn it over now to Dr. Aliyah Khan, who will be followed by Dr. Michael Gomez to give some commentary and respond to these great presentations.
Thank you, Suad. And thank you so much to all of the speakers, Jason, Margarita, and Nathaniel, and then earlier to Dr. Gomez, whose keynote I was very excited to hear. I'm like Suad, I'm just like bursting with ideas and questions over everything you've said. I have specific things, like specific thematics that I see in all of your work, but in an overarching sense, I want to start off by suggesting two ideas that bind your papers and bring them all together. First, I'm really fascinated by this idea of the plantation unexpectedly as a site of encounter for the Ummah. Beginning first with Dr. Gomez's remarks, Dr. Gomez mentioned briefly at the end of his talk that indentured Indian indentured Indian laborers in 1838 on British plantations encountered encountered some of the few remaining African Muslims on the British Caribbean plantations. And there are stories of where, they exchanged Qurans and they were shocked to find each other and this kind of stuff. Similarly, we have things like, you know, Nathaniel, you mentioned the encounters in the Indian Ocean between people who are Arab and through enslavement, who are Arab, East African, as well as, we also know that some of the enslaved people in that Gulf region came from places like Baluchistan. So, you just have all of these people who are meeting from everywhere. Another theme is the decentering is the way in which I think all of your work, in fact, even though this panel is about plantations, it decenters and expands the idea of the plantation. Margarita, you mentioned in addition to like this space that we commonly think of as as the geographic plantation, which is just like, the big space where, you grow sugar, cotton, tobacco. Margarita, you're also talking about maroon communities, quilombos, cattle ranches in the Dominican Republic. You also spoke about, along with Professor Gomez, you also spoke about the Malay Rebellion, which, as we know, is not just any rebellion, and it's not a plantation rebellion. It's the largest, occurring in Salvador. It's the largest urban slave revolt in the Americas, and remarkable for being that. Nathaniel, your work also decenters the plantation in thinking about, and just that region at all, right? There are other sites of enslavement that are important here, like for example, pearl diving, and encounters on and things that have to do with like encounters on the ocean. Jason, I saw that opera. I flew to San Francisco. We need to talk. We need to talk. I flew to San Francisco to see the last performance of it. What was it, in 2023? And I was just like blown away completely. Um, I was struck by exactly the same things you were struck by. The recitation of Al-Fatiha on an operatic stage in this traditional form of European Italian opera. I was like, where am I? What's happening? Like, am I in a mosque? What is this? Um, it blew my mind. And because relatively, like not that long ago, actually a year ago in 2022, I had seen X, the Malcolm X opera in Detroit. So it was, and what blew me away about the Malcolm X opera, among other things, was the recreation of that famous photograph of him praying in the Muhammad Ali Mosque in Cairo and sitting on this red carpet or kneeling on this red carpet, and there's these like lights above him, and he's alone. And then we heard Al-Fatiha. So like there's this kind of continuity here where the Quran and the recitation of Al-Fatiha is this like through line that connects all of these like instances of Black Muslim performance. So I'd be really interested in hearing you talk more about that, like that Quranic encounter. And by the way, too, like I was also struck by the staging of the Omar Ibn Said opera with the idea of printing the autobiography in Arabic itself on the clothing and the drapery on the stage that looked kind of like sails. I was so fascinated by it that I tore a page out of my friend's notebook and I sketched it while I was sitting there. I need to see if I could find that, but we need to talk, obviously. Uh, Another theme that I would like, I'd be interested in hearing people addressing here is this role of Muslim women and enslaved women in these narratives. Margarita, you brought up, these women who were leaders in rebellions, and, both spoke about Omar Ibn Said's narrative, in which there aren't really any women, but the opera introduces his mother and centers this figure of his mother who keeps recurring throughout the entire opera. There's like a sort of love interest. The opera introduces women where there aren't any in the original autobiography, where Omar himself is really just concerned about his patrilineal heritage and his scholarly heritage, which is, primarily male. And we know that, in the Quran and Islamic schools of West Africa, women had been educated in them since the 15th century, along with men. And yet these women's histories are not present in the New World. These enslaved African Muslim women's histories, even though they were educated, are not present in the New World in the same way that men's histories are. We have some texts for men. So, a question would be, how do these like instantiations of like introducing Omar's mother into the narrative, and Margarita, emphasizing the role of women leaders of slave revolts, like how does that complete our narrative, or what does that do for us historically? Lastly, this is a huge question, but at the end of this, at the end of all of these papers, I was just left wondering about this overall question of reckoning with the history of enslavement while establishing continuity with ongoing systems of oppression in the Muslim world, and in and affecting Africa itself. I'm thinking about this because 3 days ago, I was at the Bin Jalmoud House in Doha. I'm super jet lagged. I just got back from Qatar like yesterday. And the Bin Jalmoud House is a house that was owned by a former slave trader that is now dedicated to Qatar's history of reckoning with Qatar's history of enslavement, both like earlier enslavement where people from East Africa and Balochistan were enslaved in the pearl diving trade, as well as other forms of enslavement. And it specifically establishes a continuity. This is the Qatari state establishing a continuity with the system of the kafala system that's essentially, indentureship of contemporary migrants. And the Qatari state has done all kinds of stuff to actually dismantle the kafala system in 2020 and 2021. But they struck me as reckoning with their history of enslavement in a way that people in the Americas don't. There's an entire museum dedicated to it where the state admits like the people's complicity. So how do we do this? Like, how do we reckon with the specificity of African Muslim enslavement in the New World? Other people are doing it in the Indian Ocean. How should we do it here? There is no museum dedicated to the history of enslavement in the United States. Yes, of course, there's Black history writ large, but not this specific one to enslavement. I could, keep going, but I'll give Dr. Gomez a chance to respond.
Well, thank you, Dr. Khan. And I don't know that we've met. I hope to meet you at some point if we haven't.
We haven't met, but I have read all of your work, so thank you.
It's very kind of you. It's very kind of you. The same thing with Dr. Rosa. We're in the same city, so I don't know why. I don't know what that's about, but we should rectify that. And I do know Professor Mathews. I do know Professor Young. We go back a ways, so it's good to see you, and I do appreciate your presentations. And I think that I have a number of different thoughts about these presentations. I'm not sure that I will achieve a kind of coherence. I'm not sure that I'll be able to bring them together. But I'm struck with Professor Rosa's divergent cartography, the plantation as a place of repression, the Quilombo or Palenque as a place of refuge, and connect, and so connected with this divergence is the notion of a kinetic response. Yeah, a kinetic response, that people move, that people act, that people respond physically and in ways that seek for a kind of permanent resolution to these circumstances. In a number of instances, led by women, and that's great that you are raising this and uncovering this kind of information. I think that Professor Mathews' approach is a little different. And that is to say that he is this. I'm coming to you, Dr. Young, because I think that I'll take it in this order. And I think that I hear in Professor Mathews' commentary a kind of investment, if you will, and a kind of difference in understanding what's happening in the Indian Ocean as opposed to the Atlantic world. We can have that conversation another time. But this focus, this drilling down on public healing as a response, is intriguing. I'm thinking about James Sweet's work as well. Doesn't have anything to do with Islam necessarily, but the notion that both in South America as well as in the Iberian context, the person about whom he's talking, his name escapes me, is a kind of public healer whose services are requested by Africans, Europeans, everybody's coming to this person and seeing him as a public healer. But the idea that public healing represents a kind of response to repression is very intriguing to me. And I did allude to this. I mean, you do connect this to the Muradia, and I don't know how to reconcile these approaches, because in my reading of the history, this is an approach. Yeah, the Amadou Bamba's approach to the French is it's a very interesting approach, and it is in contrast to Elijah Omar. I don't know how to reconcile those approaches, and I think that what that for me represents is that the Dar al-Islam is not united in it's not necessarily a unanimity in how it responds to repression, but I'm wrestling with that. Yeah, I'm wrestling with that. Now, Dr. Young's experience in Charleston is really fascinating. In that I think what I'm hearing is that in the operatic presentation of Omar ibn Said's life, in recalling that, in the performance of this particular memory, there is at least a germ of reconciliation of trying to approach a kind of healing. Yeah. And I want to kind of explore that with you, because, and I want to bring this all the way back to the kind of undergirding that the project has with respect to the plantation as a source of coercive production, and the question of how race is manipulated, right, to enhance this production. And I'm wondering about this, because I do find in my own work, in my own research, I do find the notion of the African Muslim as an exception. This is an exception, this representing exceptionality. And then the question, so this is the perspective of those on the outside. And so because and even in this opera, I haven't seen the opera. I have to see it now. I haven't seen it, although I was invited to see it. But he's totally encompassed by words. And this is what strikes me. And in the historical record, this is what comes up over and over and over again, the literate African. And and what does this mean? Yeah. And so I think we do have to explore more how the world of the power structure that seeks to exploit labor, seeks to exploit this these differences. And we need to put that into conversation with how the Muslim community responds to that. And it makes for an interesting, complex. It's not a tidy resolution. As we see what's happening, as we see what's unfolding in the case of Sudan, this is not a tidy resolution. All right, and we're looking at this is unfolding before our very eyes, where these are all Muslim communities in Sudan. Okay, and there's a racial component to what's happening. And so this is not easy to reconciliation is not an easy thing to arrive at. The kind of sanitation so there's a public the kind of sanitizing by way of this performance that Professor Young is talking about, not necessarily historical. So this is so I guess the way perhaps that I can kind of sum it up is that the person of the Muslim is critical to how this plantation experience is understood and holds the key, to how we understand the unfolding of slavery, both in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean. So there you are.
Yeah, right. That's perfect though, because I mean, of course, that's one of the motivating forces of this whole seminar, right? The kind of the centrality, right, of this Africana Muslim to these global systems, these global transformations, this type of thing. I'm thinking about the presentations too. It's like Dale Machasasos and public healing, right? Like, how do those things connect? What is the relationship between that? I also saw Omar. I actually watched it online. Right, so I didn't see it in person, but this idea, this the point that Dr. Gomez makes about this kind of exceptional literate African. So this exceptional literate African story is being retold, right, to then become this solve, right, for kind of like this history and contemporary reality of racial oppression in the United States today, right? So instead of dealing with it, we tell this story of this, once again, this exceptional literate African, right, does this kind of work, which is really interesting, right? I think in terms of that, and I think one of the things also I see in the presentations, and we're running out of time, so I just wanted to say something and then ask a question that came out of the conversations that opened up to the panelists, right? So you guys can respond, and we'll try to figure out how to not take too much time in general, right? But really, I think about sort of these ideas of kind of these linking of, past and present. I think this was something that definitely came out, right, in all of your presentations. And so the question that I wanted to ask, right, that came up, and I think just to follow up with what Dr. Khan said, right, and this is Margarita, I saw your hand, so this is actually probably mostly to you too. It's like, how do we find, recover, understand Black Muslim women in this archive, right? Like, how do we find them? Where are they? How do we do that, right? Because we definitely, the men are there, we see them and we know why, right? But how do we sort of find the stories, right, of these women?
I love this conversation. And what makes it hard to find Muslim women in the archive is because of what Horton Spillers called the ungendering that happens during the Middle Passage. And so, how do you retain piety? How do you retain modesty when it's literally being stripped away from you, right? And so that coercive nature of slavery makes even retention very difficult. Even in these documents that I'm referring to, it's rare to even see among the students of the Turkish scholar women. Right. We know that there were many women who participated in the 1835 Malay Revolt, including famously Luisa Main, who is the mother of the famous Brazilian poet Luis Gama. And so we know that women were involved, right, including in its downfall. But we don't exactly have exact pictures of them because of the necessity to obfuscate. But I want to say a couple of things to answer in 2 minutes to every other contribution that has been made. I love this provocation of the literate African and what does it mean? And what I want to argue is that not only do we have these representations by, for example, Omar ibn Said of an actual person who's using letters, but in the cases of Fermina Lukumi, who we saw, and Maria de Cota, they are using literacy, letters, and their own words that actually land in the archive. So in the case of Maria de Cota, 1575, I, Maria de Cota, am a natural of Santo Domingo, and now I want to go back because I am free of captivity. And then in the 1800s, Fermina Lucumí saying, dale de machetazos, because he's the one who put you in chains. So they're both using commanding language. They're 3 centuries apart and they're coming at it with the same amount of force. We often think that Black women are silent in the archive. I want to say it's actually the opposite. We're not listening to them properly. The last thing I want to say is I want to tell y'all a little bit about what happened to Fermina Lucumí. Fermina Lucumi's partner, Carlota, was killed and was found on the plantation the next day. But Fermina Lucumi was actually arrested in a group of 8. Out of the 8, she was the only woman. The 7 men were fusilados, so killed with a gun, but she was burned to death. Why? Why was the only woman burned to death? And the reason we might believe is in part to demonstrate, to serve as a warning, but also because the power of her body as a potential site of veneration equaled trouble to the plantation owners and the idea of other women leading the rebellions, because Carlota and Fermina were actually the leaders of this rebellion. So I want to leave us with those little bits of kind of broadenings of the so-called archival silences that I actually want to argue are actually right in front of our eyes if we want to listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna hand it off to Jason and then Nathaniel just for some closing remarks, responses to the commentary and closing remarks. Yeah.
I'll just say there are a couple of things that came up, and I'll try to limit this to just 1 minute or two. In response to Professor Gomez's question and comments, the thing about my experience that's so remarkable is that part of the larger context of Charleston and the South in this moment that we're in right now marks the absolute impossibility of being Muslim in a certain way. This is the kind of source of those so-called anti-Sharia laws. So even that exceptional historical Muslim who's literate and is writing Arabic and who can be celebrated historically is not accepted in the present day if he or she is speaking Arabic, or if he or she is kind of expressing or performing their ritual lives in a kind of full way. So there's this interesting way in which the operatic stage provides some kind of cover where you can accept a thing when it's being performed, but you'll walk right outside and you'll denigrate that very same thing at the same time. The last thing I'll say in response to Aliyah's comments is that I gave a criminally short synopsis of the opera. For those of you who saw it will know for sure how criminally brief that synopsis was. But the interesting thing about Omar's mother, the character of Omar's mother, is that she's killed in the conflict that causes Omar's enslavement. Her staying with him throughout the course of the opera strikes me as a critical moment at the intersection of Islam and African ideas around ancestry and ancestral connections. Omar's mother remains with him both as a Muslim mother, but also as an African mother. And that kind of intersection of what it means to be African and Muslim at the same time is part of what keeps her with him throughout the course of the opera.
Thank you. Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you. Nathaniel.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about and respond to. I've enjoyed hearing from all of you, and I think one of the things maybe I'll leave us with is something I've been thinking about in light of the theme, and that is what the politics of memory on plantations today. Whether or not some of the history that we've discussed here is making it into the public history that's presented at these plantation sites. I know from my own experience in living in Mississippi that actually several plantations were converted into tourist sites where people could spend the night at a slave cabin. So this just brings in the contemporary politics of memory as it relates to how the history of plantations are presented. And I wonder, what is the role of the Africana Muslim, or is there this kind of generic assumption that, well, all enslaved Africans were Christian on southern plantations, to say nothing of the Caribbean and Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you. That's actually I love these ending points, right? Like the women are there. We're just not listening to them, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, the Africana Muslim and this and the we said about sort of this plantation memory. I mean, I think the way that each of you closed is really helpful, because one of the questions I had, which we can't answer too, was like, what is the future, right, of this kind of work? Right, the kind of work that you're doing, right? And I think you're demonstrating a lot of what this future looks like, and where are the places and the kind of questions that we still want to and can continue to answer. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your presentations, for your contributions. Again, for those who've been paying attention and watching, this is our second session of our series on Africana Muslim and genealogies of white supremacy. Our third session is coming up next month. I just wanted to share that before we left today. This session is focusing on media culture, and we have it's also sort of two events, although 2 different days. We have a panel discussion thinking about the media, right? And the media, the way the media makes race a reality, but also the ways in which those who are racialized, right, sort of resist, right, and use and reimagine realities and futures through the media. So we have a panel discussion with Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik, Rebecca Hankins, Edward Curtis IV, and Cam Copeland. And then we're also going to have this, our keynote will be a conversation between Kayla Wheeler and Zahir Ali, thinking about these questions of the media as well. Again, if you're following our YouTube page, if you're on the email list, right, you'll get those links to that too. We encourage you to register and to attend those as well. So I wanted to share that. And again, I just want to thank Doctors Rosa, Mathews, Khan, Young, Gomez, right, for these really, I think, really generative, because what we're trying to do with this whole seminar is to really, like, to your point too, Nate, it's like there's a lot of assumptions about, right, race and religion, right? A lot of assumptions and about a lot of glossing that happens. And so when we center, right, the Africana Muslim, we center a sort of a figure, so to speak, that is at a lot of different intersections. What does that generate? What new questions, what new things happen, right? That's what we're trying to do. And I think, as the young kids said, y'all knew the assignment. Y'all knew the assignment, and it was a fantastic conversation today. So thank you again, and we'll catch everyone next time.